Welcome to the Product Quest podcast. Thanks for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Scott Burleson, and joining me as always, my co-hosts Jan Vermouth and Jonathan Edwards. Today we welcome our very special guest, Michele Hansen. Michele is the co-founder of the software as a service company Geocodio, along with her husband Matthias. Prior to being an entrepreneur, Michele was a product manager in financial publishing and a project manager for a web development agency. She's a co-host of the Software Social podcast, a weekly conversation between two SaaS founders, self-described as one starting out and one who's established. Michele is the author of an excellent book on customer interviewing, Deploy Empathy, which we are certain to get into today. Michele Hansen, welcome to the Product Quest podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course, we're going to get into Deploy Empathy and all that fun stuff. But first, I'd like to begin with the fact that you live on a farm in the Danish countryside. That sounds so amazing. Tell us a little bit about that farm and how that came to be.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of, describe it as sort of a quote unquote farm because we don't have any animals. But we mostly have a lot of different kinds of fruits. And I was talking to someone about it the other day and I was like, well, if we got, 50 kilos of raspberries, 50 kilos of strawberries last year, like plus apples, figs, pears, plums, currants, more stuff. I can't even remember. I was like, maybe we could call it like a fruit farm, and we don't sell it. We just kind of give it away. Or if neighbors show up, we're like, please pick some strawberries, please. And take whatever you pick. But yeah, it's my husband is originally from here. We lived in the U.S. together in Virginia for about 10 years. And then COVID happened and he's originally from here. And we're like, you know what, maybe we should just like go to Denmark for a year and just, schools are open versus they weren't where we lived. And then once we got here, we just loved it and decided to stay.
Yeah, that's it. Just sounds so amazing. We've loved, or personally, I've loved keeping up with the progress of the shed quarters, as you call it.
Yes, recording from there today.
Oh yeah. So the farm life, how has it affected or impacted your professional life anyway? What have you learned from being a fruit farmer there in Denmark?
Again, fruit farmer sort of in quotes here, but yeah. It's funny, like, my husband will say, oh, it's like having a code problem. I'm just going to go tractoring for a while. Like we watched, I don't know if you've seen Jeremy Clarkson's show, Clarkson's Farm, highly relatable for us. Like we had an incident, a year and a half ago when our tractor got stuck in a field in a snowstorm and there's a lot of, two people moved to the country from the city and much hilarity ensues going on.
Right.
But, it's like really nice, right? Like, at the end of the workday in the summer and the fall, like I can just, go like, pick a couple of kilos of raspberries and it just kind of clears my head and just, it gets me outside. Like I found, working for ourselves from home, there were days when, I only went outside for maybe 20 minutes total to walk the dog or, take our daughter to school and back, which is in the car. So being here, I can go out and do something in the garden. I can go jump on our trampoline, right? Like there's other stuff to do and to, I guess, literally ground me. Where of course we're quite a bit busier with maintaining everything, but we also enjoy that. Like it can be satisfying to go mulch a bunch of trees after a long day. So,
well, especially,
but
go ahead, Jan.
Sorry, I'm following you on Twitter, so I kind of you always give updates. So it's not just maintain, but you're also you build more or less the whole place, or is that wrong?
Yeah, there was a house and 3 barns here when we moved in. Okay. We actually ended up tearing down one. It was the old hen house. We wanted to make that into an office when we bought the property. And then we had an architect and a contractor look at it and they were like, so we ended up tearing it down and building this shed as our office. And yeah, I mean, we're making some changes to the house too, but this farm has been here for, I want to say at least 150 years. Like our barns, are over 100 years old easily. but for a Danish farm, that's pretty new. Like, yeah.
I would think so. That has to be a nice counter. I mean, so much of our professional lives is in front of screens, and I'm assuming yours is that way a lot. So that's got to be a nice counterbalance to get outside and get some vitamin D, and you can get vitamin C from your fruit, and just to do something physical. I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, let's talk about customer interviewing. How did Michele learn initially this art of customer interviewing?
So I learned it when I was a product manager. I think it's part of why it's become something that's so important to me, is because it was just revelatory for me as a product manager. I went from looking at data and numbers and, basically making very educated, formula-driven decisions about how to improve KPIs. And then those things we did not working and feeling frustrated and doing that over and over again. To then when I was fortunate enough to be working with several, experienced designers and researchers who really brought that practice into our team, both with usability testing and with exploratory customer interviews. And that just unlocked so much learning for us. And it made me feel so much more connected to the product and to the customers as well. It also helped with our team, because bringing, our developers into a usability session, like when we later, put an item on the board to, move the location of a button or add something, there's no conversation about, well, why do we need to do that in the first place? And why is that more important than this? Like, they had seen it in the usability session that people couldn't find it. People couldn't use the thing that they had built. And so it just improved our team velocity. It improved my decision-making as a product manager. And then when I went full-time on Geocodio, I really got the opportunity to start talking to our customers more deeply. And it both, shapes our strategic direction, our roadmap. But it also it makes me really enjoy my job, because I get to hear about how we're helping people and why they're using us and what they used before and how that was annoying and how it's not a problem for them anymore. And they're usually so grateful that we exist in the first place. And, on the longest days, that's a helpful thing to be able to call back to and have that kind of, I think, a little bit of a personal connection with the people you're making something for. But if you're not from a UX background, it's unlikely that you learned how to do interviews. And I found myself talking to a lot of other founders about product strategy, and we invested in a couple of funds for other small independent software companies. And so, I would start, mentoring those founders and talking about customer interviews, and just, I felt like I didn't really have one solid, rigorous, approachable place to send them. But that's kind of how I got into customer interviews and how I started writing a book about it, which you didn't ask, but I answered anyway.
We're definitely getting to that, but it sounds like there wasn't like did you go through any training, or was it really just all learned by doing, you definitely had some mentors, it sounded like.
Yeah, I didn't ever go to like a training per se, but I read a lot of books, and articles. So Clayton Christensen, Tony Ulwick, Bob Muesta. I think I also read When Coffee and Kale Compete as well. Intercom on Jobs to Be Done. Actually, that came out a couple of years after I learned how to do it, but I do like that book. And then, just, observing people who are doing it. I probably was just an observer in the room for the first couple of months, wasn't actually running the sessions myself until I graduated into being sort of the number two person who was helping out in the interview, until I was eventually the one leading them myself. But that probably took about 6 months or so, working with people who were very experienced, and just so grateful for that experience, quite frankly.
That's exactly the way how I learned. I don't have any kind of I don't have a paper or formal training on this, but I spent a lot of time watching people that I know are really good at this. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of follow them. And then at one point, it's like learning to swim, right? At one point you have to jump in the water and just try for yourself, and then you kind of more or less, if you're a person that is really interested in improving, you will improve, I think.
So Jan, if somebody had read a book on swimming and hadn't tried it yet, you would you think they should still use a life jacket, I assume?
Well, a little bit of a life jacket is always good.
Floaties.
Floaties.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Which I think is kind of the equivalent of, using an off-the-shelf script, right? Like maybe you can't come up with your own script, or you have a bank of follow-up phrases that you can use when they say something, right? Like you're not going in entirely, in just a swimsuit. I guess we're continuing this analogy, but like, they've got a kickboard and some floaties, right? Like they're not going to drown. They've got some things to fall back on.
I love that.
And
go ahead.
And you can do interviews. I mean, at least not in the first time, but after a couple of times, we did interviews so you have kind of two interviewees. I mean, back then we
interviewers?
did actual physical, a physical room, and we were 3 people. So 2 that kind of interviewed and one interviewee and 2 interviewers. And you just kind of have so somebody is sitting beside you or in the corner. And if things go wrong, they can just quickly jump in. And that worked pretty well in the beginning. So kind of like maybe that's kind of flow or somebody you can fall back onto is also really nice. If you have if you have somebody like that in your environment. So I don't know, but probably founders like you, where you probably are very often you're quite alone, I assume, or there's not many people and you just kind of have to try and go.
Yeah, I think it's ideal to be able to be interviewing in a pair. But yeah, in a lot of cases, you just don't have that kind of resources, whether it's because you're the founder and you're doing it yourself, or you're the only UX and product person in the company, or you're a developer who happens to really care about this and you're taking it on as a side project within your role. And so even if it might be, better to do it as a pair, like if you're going to get 90% of the insights from doing it yourself, then that's better than 0.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the other nice thing, you mentioned this, that you would bring, I forget if you said it was a developer or a UX person, but you had them to come along. And I wanted to call back to that because, it's if a product manager does all the work by themselves and they bring their brilliance to the developers, and here is what I have learned, that doesn't, I see you smiling, that doesn't work nearly as well as when we all do it together. And then we learn these things together, and then the execution of whatever these problems, it actually helps a lot with their creativity. They're already sort of working on the problems. And so if you go by yourself, I find that you're saying, this is what Scott's saying. Scott says this, but if you go together as a team, this is what our customers say. And it's and I want you mentioned that. I just wanted to call that out as something I think is quite important personally.
Yeah, I love how Erica Hall puts this in her book, Just Enough Research, where she says, the person doing the interviews, or the research like shows up and they're kind of like descending from their pedestal of being like, hello, I have all of this blessed research, like, and it is for you to just, passively consume and be influenced by, right? Like it doesn't really go well because people aren't bought into it at all. It just comes off as kind of condescending, and it actually even if it contains really good insights, like the way it's delivered is not optimal. And so it really helps to have people in the room. And even if you can't have every one of your developers in the room or your other stakeholders, having at least one there for one of the interviews, so that when the VPs are sitting around being like, what are they doing? Like, what is this? It seems like a waste of time. They're just talking to people. There's at least someone in there saying, you know what? No, actually, I learned something and that I didn't even know after, being in this business for 10 years. Right. Like, and then they can be like, okay, well, if somebody I know thinks this is a good idea, if they learn something from it, then maybe it's okay. And you basically you have social proof within the company.
Yeah. Great point. And I love what you said about, I found it a little funny. The executives are saying, well, they're just talking to people. What are they doing? It's like, that can't be useful. As opposed to thinking about they're learning, they're pulling in information. That's something that's very thematic. I feel like as product managers, we have to fight for our right to, for time.
Research. fight for our right to research.
No,
This is
but I think that is really
latest Beastie Boys remix.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, that's really true. I mean, I think very often if somebody isn't used to, and sometimes they're rather high up the ladder, but isn't used to this, especially solution-free interviews, it can feel like very, very confusing. Like, why
Just
aren't you
threatening.
talking about our products? Like,
Yeah.
so because that's the perspective, and I completely get why they're just confused by it. And but the researcher usually who sits there, they get a lot of information and they're really happy with the interview. And then you have a confused senior level person in there who doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. So can have really happen.
Yeah, and it's I think I don't know if it's a personality trait or what, but well, if you think about the stages of brainstorming, like the first stage, all ideas are good ideas, and there's lots of open questions and exploration, and some people are naturally comfortable with that ambiguity and just letting things be open and flow. And then some people are very uncomfortable. It's like, well, this feels like a waste of time. It feels like we need to. That idea you came up with. That's a terrible idea. Which is there's a reason why we don't reserve judgment. And similarly, there's some folks often in leadership who are uncomfortable with the nature of a customer interview, where you're letting them lead, you're exploring things with them, and if it doesn't feel structured. If I had a client one time that was sitting next to me, kept wanting to pull me aside and discuss how it was going, which was very disruptive to the process. So I think a big takeaway. Let me just ask you. So, what challenges? How do product managers overcome that? This negotiating for time with leadership, helping to communicate the value, the importance of this. When we know leadership's like, hey, I want to sell something, I want to launch something, I want immediate. They just want something so quick and tangible. What advice would you give for somebody who's really trying to promote, to fight for their right to research?
I mean, so I won't claim to be an expert on that side of it. It's been 5 years since I worked in a larger company and had to do that kind of internal politicking. But I will say, I mean, bring them into the process, right? Like, just get them to say, you know what, the research says if you just start with 5, right? If I can spend 5 hours on this over the next 2 weeks, and I would love to have you sit in the room with me, show them the scripts in advance, right? Like, maybe, not necessarily bring them into the workshopping, but like, this is what we're asking them. This is why, like, just kind of include them a little bit in the process, right? And just so that they don't feel either, threatened or confused by it. But it's difficult, right? Like, I mean, introducing research into an organization that doesn't do it is a slog. And I mean, anybody going through that can tell you how hard it is. And it really depends on the organization. But I think, wherever you can, to include people. And so it doesn't feel like, there's these people off in this room doing this special thing that nobody knows about, and then they're going to come out and tell us what to do. Like, nobody really likes that. And so include people.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. Fantastic. Let's move on to your book. It's interesting. It's interesting, as important as customer interviewing as a skill is, how few books there really are on it. There was a book by a guy named Edmund McQuarrie for years called Customer Visits. It's not in print anymore. The author just wasn't that interested, I guess. But there's a few things I can point to here and there. But that was one of the things I really gravitated to your book, because there's just not that many that I've run across that are just cover interviewing from end to end. So let's begin with the title as we get into your book. Deploy Empathy. What does that mean?
So the title was kind of meant to be a wink to developers to let them know that this was a book for them. Because again, when I first started writing, that was really the audience, was like developers who have turned into founders, developers launching their own companies. And interviewing sounds kind of like soft and squishy or maybe scary. And I wanted them to know that this was a book for them. And so using the word deploy in it was a way to do that, but also you're using empathy, and you're using it in for very, specific business reasons, right? Though my goal is to help people use it in the rest of their life too. I learned much later that it's apparently also one of Gary Vaynerchuk's catchphrases. And I think if I had known that going into it, I would not have chosen that title, but now I'm stuck with it. So, that is what it is.
But I feel
yeah,
it's
it's all about how to
feel-
really, I wanted to, I guess the book is supposed to be very practical. So I think also the other thing about the word deploy is that it's not a word that implies theoretical. It implies getting out and using it.
Yeah, I really like the title, by the way, because I think there is many things in there. There is a little bit of a tension in there, you could say. I mean, how can you deploy? Deploy is a very functional, practical word. Empathy has other associations. So I really like this play in a certain sense, and it makes perfect sense how you explain it. Like it's not about the book. Kind of, I mean, you could say learn empathy or how to become an emphatic person, but that is not what the book is about. Like it's how can you use this tool or this skill, empathy, more or less. Like is that fair to say?
Yeah. It's focused on using it practically. And I mean, there's also already a book that's fantastic that I love called Practical Empathy by Andy Young. And I when I was originally naming it, I was like, what people write, write a landing page or make more sales or, get more conversions, build this feature on their daily to-do list. They don't write, be more empathetic, right? Like, unless a therapist has told them that, right? Like they probably don't, that's not something that makes it on their to-do list. And so I was like, how can I teach people how to have more empathy for themselves and other people through the process of something that they are already trying to do in the first place?
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's funny. We were actually discussing the title amongst ourselves about it, and it makes it memorable. I mean, you could have called it, the Handbook of Customer Interviewing. You could have been much more to the point, but it's just that sort of makes it blend into the handbook of everything else, right? So deploy empathy. It's memorable. I think it's an inspired title. Now, what audience did you specifically have in mind?
So yeah, originally it was developers who are building their own products. So whether that's already full-time or they have a side project that they would like to become full-time. And it's been quite a surprise to all of the other people who have started using the book. My favorite part of the writing process was when I interviewed 30 of the people who had been reading the newsletter that I wrote, because I wrote the entire rough draft of the book as a newsletter. So every chapter or half chapter went out as an email. And so when I felt like I was pretty much done with the content, I took time to interview 30 people who had been reading that newsletter. And I expected a lot of them to be, I'm a developer and I have my own SaaS. It's a 1-person thing. It's a 10-person thing, or I have a side project. And there's people who, I'm a copywriter in the furniture industry. I'm a real estate agent. Like just all of these different people that I didn't really write for when I was writing those emails. And yeah, architects, like all these people who, I never expected to be part of the readership, and also other product and UX people, which was kind of surprising because I felt like customer interviewing was kind of covered for us, so to speak, right? Like, there's Jim Kalbach's book, there's Steve Portigal's book, like, of course, Bob Moesta's books and Clayton Christensen and like Tony Ulwick. And like, there's so many books on that versus for the, developer founder, like the Mom Test is really the only book on that. And a lot of people had read that book. And in many ways, my ideal reader in the developer founder category is somebody who's already read that book. And then they would say, well, but how do I figure out why I'm having churn? Like, the book helped them figure out what they should build in the first place. But not some of the questions that come on down the line. How do I talk to somebody who's canceled? How do I get feedback on a landing page I made? But it's been very surprising to see the reaction from product people as well.
Well, I love a lot of those authors you mentioned. I have to say though, I don't think any of them do as good a job as you do with the customer interview, with the qualitative interview. You're sitting across recruiting, just as a very tangible example. One of the most difficult things is how do you set up the interviews? And a lot of books they just leave out the topic altogether, or you just hire a third party or whatever. And you in a very practical way have like steps about how do you actually line up customers, and if that doesn't work, then you can try this. So I really think I love all those references you mentioned, but I don't think they address this as directly as your book did. And there's another thing I found quite special about it, and your book, the tone is very encouraging. I mentioned that I mentioned that I finished listening. I feel like I know you, even though I don't, because I listened to your audiobook, and I feel like you and I have spent time walking around. You've been in the car with me, and we've been hanging out. I realize that's not 100% true, but it feels that way. But your book as written is very encouraging. And your tone in the audiobook, so wonderfully done, also very encouraging. Was that like intentional, or is that just sort of your natural personality? Or I'm wondering, did you say, I really want this to be an encouraging book, or I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I really wanted people to understand what it is like to be on the receiving end of empathy through the process of reading the book. So it was very important to me to treat the reader empathetically. And also, thinking back to my original audience, a lot of them hadn't spent much time in front of customers before. I just, one founder, for example, he's been running his SaaS for 4 years, and he said that he had only spoken to a customer, on the phone once in 4 years. Had done everything else via email. And so I was like, we really have to start from the ground up and make people feel like that they can do this, and that it will be worth their time if they do it. But I guess give them, I find so often when I interview people that, maybe you got them on the phone in the first place because you promised them a $25 Amazon gift card or whatever. But by the end of the call, many people will reject that. Instead, they're grateful for you for taking the time to listen to them. And I just wanted it, because most people don't have people in our lives who really just listen to us about some problem that we have, even if, you have like a wonderful spouse, like you probably haven't told them in depth for an hour about everything you do on a weekly basis to make sure the invoices get paid, right? Or all those just sort of little boring everyday things. And so when you do have that happen, there's just this kind of, it's kind of a profound feeling. And I wanted to try to give that feeling to the reader, so that when I am telling them how they are trying to make someone else feel, regardless of what kind of background they come from, maybe they had incredibly empathetic parents, or maybe they didn't, just from the process of reading the book, they understand that feeling that they're trying to cultivate in someone else.
It's written like a conversation. Yeah. Like when you're reading it, it's like, obviously we're not able to communicate back with you unless we have some kind of psychological problems, but you speak with pauses, and it's very much when you're reading it, it's like you're talking to the reader. And I find that very enjoyable. And there's a couple of things I want to respond to. Hopefully I can remember them all. Well, one is, so in my business, we train people to interview customers and whatnot. And, a lot of times they'll go through the training and they're excited, and it comes time to get started and they just sort of stop. They just sort of get stuck. And my belief is that there's a fear and they're just uncomfortable and they just can't get, they need that encouragement. They need, and I've tried things, but I feel like just in the tone, just in the cheerleading is not exactly the right word, but just the encouraging nature of your book. Yeah. To help bolster them a little bit. And I believe you, if I remember correctly, I'm not going to have your phrasing exactly right, but you mentioned that sometimes interviews just don't go well, and don't take it personally. It's just, that's why you do multiple interviews. And so you can't always you can't take complete responsibility on this dynamic experience with another person. It's alive, and you take a little bit of a risk. But I definitely can't think of any other resource that is as encouraging as yours is, and addresses that fear. So it's not all about knowledge of doing a customer interview. It's about, getting over your internal anxiety about sitting down in front of somebody. That's one of the challenges that I have. So I thought that was really good.
And I really like how you address this openly. I mean, a lot of the, let's say other books, they might give you the method, but you really address this very openly. You say it can feel scary, but it's going to be okay. So you're really addressing the emotion. And I think you really hit the right emotions that people usually have before an interview. So I just want to kind of concur. So Scott is really, time and again in your book, you say it's okay to feel scared. It's okay if that blah blah. So it's just this. I don't know why people are then so nervous about this, to be honest. So what is the fear behind this? I mean, could also say, well,
yeah. I mean, people are afraid of offending someone. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're afraid it's going to be awkward. They're doing it in a business context. They're afraid that if they say something weird, that it's going to reflect poorly on the company, or, I think there's kind of some, like, if it's existing customers, there's a little bit of a, poking a sleeping bear kind of fear, right? That's like, if you ask a customer why they're happy with your product, they're all of a sudden going to decide that they hate it. Like, there's definitely that fear, right? Like, it's like, geez, they're paying us, just leave them alone, right? Like, just shh. Like, so, I mean, it really depends on the person too, right? I think, and people coming from many different conversation styles have this fear. Like, so, talkative people like me might be afraid that we're going to say too much. Quieter people might be afraid that they're not going to know what to say, but even people who are talkative might be worried that they don't know what to say, right? And so I think it's important to recognize the fear, and that's part of the showing the readers empathy, right? Is because there's a big difference between many people are afraid when they go to do customer interviews, but don't worry about that feeling, just put it out of your mind, versus saying it's completely normal to be worried about doing interviews and it's okay.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference.
Yeah. 100%. It's like in the first example, it's like, just forget about it. That doesn't even, I mean, how do you even do that? It's
not going to work.
Instead, just to acknowledge it. It's normal. It's natural, but don't let that stop you. Just, sort of embrace that a bit.
If you tell someone don't worry, they're going to worry. Like, the operative word in that sentence is worry. When you negate a negative word, that is what somebody hears.
Yeah.
And that was something that I was very attuned to throughout the book as well, is using more positive, sort of affirming language that was not sort of fake positive, right? It's not a like, don't worry about it, you can do it. It's okay. Like, maybe you need some more practice. Like, we don't have to run from that voice that tells us that this is something to be afraid of. Like, that's fine. We can listen to that voice.
Yeah. And I thought the level of thought you put into exactly what you're talking about now. So the different phrasings, I think you give an example in the book where you're talking about an interview you attended. I think, I'm not sure it was you who actually did the interview, but the interviewer was said, you're doing fine, when the person being interviewed had some doubts or hesitation, and didn't say don't worry, for example, or it's no problem. Don't use the word worry or problem when you're actually telling someone that there's no problem, but just use a positive framing. And I thought just that, of course, in retrospect, it makes total sense, but it's not something I would have necessarily been wary of, I think, doing an interview. I think so. The level of detail you go into in this, I think, was pretty amazing.
Yeah. And I think it's also true to the subtitle is, so let me check. So a practical guide to interviewing customers. And I really feel like so for those who haven't read the book, you should. And there is really, you write out practical questions. This is the kind of questions you can ask to follow up. This is the kinds of questions if there is a silence. It's very down to earth, very practical. And I think that in itself takes a lot of kind of stress away, because I feel like these are exactly the general idea of, okay, we should talk to a customer. Okay, you can explain that in a very abstract sense. But at one point you're sitting there and the weight is on you, and you have another person there, and now you have to guide the conversation. And then it's about practical things. So, and especially follow-up questions. That's mostly my experience when I see people that try to start talking to customers or have maybe doing the first one. It's really hard to know how to follow up. It's not like, how do you can always say, well, you have to dig deeper, but how do you, it's very hard to do. What are actually the questions? And I think you do a really nice job there of giving those questions.
Yeah, I remember reading a book, and it gave like sort of 5 or 10 tips for running an interview, and one of them was ask encouraging follow-up questions. And I was like, okay, you can hand that to somebody who has some background in UX, and they're going to know what that means. But I could not give that to one of my developer founder friends, and they would be able to just run with that. Like, this really needs to get down to brass tacks of like, okay, when you say leave pauses for them to fill, like, what do you actually mean? Like when you say to encourage them to dig deeper, how? Right? Like, how do we really, really break this down?
Yeah.
And to that point, actually, I would say out of the three of us, I'm probably the one who has the least experience interviewing customers. And I thought the breadth of wisdom that you put out in the book and the level of detail is amazing, but to the extent that sometimes I felt slightly overwhelmed of okay, how am I going to remember all of this? And we talked at the beginning about how you trained and Jan also trained with mentors and going to, but for someone who is, say, a founder, a developer founder, and who doesn't have access to these mentors, and they have your book, how would you advise them to practice these interviews? Do you have any advice, maybe?
Yeah, I spent a whole chapter in the book on building that practice, and I technically kind of two. So the first one actually has a practice interview activity that you can do with somebody else. This could be a coworker, a friend. It could be a family member. It's kind of better if it's someone who's slightly distant from you, but you could do it with your spouse. So a whole activity on how to practice it. And then there's an example of an interview in the book, and then also audio of it as well, which actually is Demand Side Sales from Bob West. It also has example interviews in it, by the way, which I think is the only other book I've seen that has example interviews. I don't know if his audiobook has them or if there's an audiobook, but an example so you know what you're trying to work towards. And then in the section on I call How to Talk So People Will Talk, every single one of those things of, use validating statements. So for example, saying that makes sense, right? Like, it's for each one of those, it's about 10 different tactics. There's an activity at the end of the chapter that is, okay, now go try this on your friends and family and coworkers for the next week. Like, just pause there, just practice not interrupting people. Okay. And then next week, let's try using validating statements. Okay, then after that, let's think more about, how we might, focus on like not correcting people. Right. Like, so all of these different things and not trying to chew it all off at once, which I think, as you said, could be quite overwhelming. Kind of leave your head spinning a bit. And then the other thing I did with that, so that people didn't have to refer back to the book all the time, was I made a set of templates that people can buy in addition to the book. So it has all of the scripts, all of the follow-up phrases, kind of all of the, like the recruitment posts, like so that the follow-up emails, like all those sort of nuts and bolts, basically, in Notion and Google Drive templates, so that people don't have to flip through the book, and they can just take the Google Drive file and just make a copy, and then, customize it for their own interviews or whatnot, or print out the list of follow-up questions so that they can look at that when they have that moment of kind of being sweaty and nervous and it's awkward and they don't know what to say. They have it right there on the paper with them.
In a training role, one of the benefits I get is I get to hear people's questions about this, their concerns. And here's a very common question they have is they say, how can I go to my customer and not be the expert? How can, they're concerned about their own ego, for lack of a better term. They don't want to appear not knowledgeable. I need to be the expert in front of my customer. And you're suggesting I let them be the expert. That's a very common question. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, this is one I remember having 2 really good calls with other founders about this one. And the way I suggest handling that is, you introduce who you are and your company, of course, but then saying, I've talked to other customers about this, or, we've been running this business for 10 years. Today, I would like to really understand how this works from your perspective. So I might understand, you say, of course, we have this experience in it. I've talked to many customers, but framing it around them, right? Because then it's not a question of, me saying, for example, so can you tell me why you need geocoding in the first place? It's instead saying, I'm really curious today. I'm hoping to learn why your company needs geocoding in the first place. How does this work in the bigger picture of what you guys are trying to do? Right. So it's not me asking a question as, what is this? And why would one need this in the first place? But is a very specific, why do you need this in the first place? Which I think really helps with that, and kind of gives some padding around, yes, I'm the founder. Yes, I need to be the expert, but I also want to give them the floor. This isn't about me and them wondering how much I know. The whole point is for me to learn what they're trying to do. And I think if you can kind of phrase it in that way, then it will help. And then people aren't like, well, why is the founder of this company asking me this question about why I use their product? Like, that seems like a dumb question. Shouldn't they know? Right? No, I want to hear specifically about why you need this. And like, what are the goals you're trying to do? How does this fit in? Where does this fit in your roadmap and your pipeline?
You have a beautiful sentence in your book. I highlighted a couple, and there you say, okay, fair enough. It's 2 sentences, but anyway. So you're writing there, many adults feel like they seem smarter when sharing their own knowledge rather than asking clarification questions. Yet that's the precise opposite of what you should do in a customer interview. And I just love this because, and I wonder if you would agree, but I mean, on the one hand, if you just try to seem smart in front of your customer, you won't learn anything. But then it's also true, you can seem smart, if you like, by asking the right questions. And I think on the other hand, so if you are being interviewed and somebody asks you good questions, you also get the impression, okay, that person really knows what they're looking for. They really know what they want to understand. So I just was wondering if or is it just completely forget about being smart or not smart, so we shouldn't even care about this? Or can there be like smart follow-up questions, or do you have to be a smart interviewer, let's say?
I don't think you have to be smart to do interviews. I don't think you even need to be knowledgeable in the field that you are asking someone about. In fact, and sometimes it's better if you have no knowledge about it. But you also don't want to fake that you have no knowledge about it either. And I think it's helpful to reframe it from appearing smart versus not smart, and appearing interested versus not interested, right? Because if someone is asking you genuine follow-up questions that show a level of, technical or subject matter understanding, but not in a kind of show-offy sort of way. Let me paraphrase, let me give you a paragraph of my knowledge before I actually ask the question, but more of a correct question that really cuts to the core of it, right? Like that shows your expertise. That also gives you really good information. So I think it's more about showing interest in them, right? And if you get them talking about themselves and their experiences, like I feel like ideally in an interview that they forget you're even a person. They forget you're even there. Like they feel like they're almost sort of alleviating themselves of this weight of, even if it's just some boring everyday business process they're doing, right? Brain imaging studies show that, parts of our brain light up when we talk about ourselves and our own experiences to other people. Those areas of the brain associated with pleasure and enjoyment and connection, they don't light up when we're listening to somebody else talk about their experience.
Yeah.
And so the more you can have them talking about their experience and framing it around them talking about themselves and what they're trying to do, the better your results will be. And maybe they don't hang up the phone and say, wow, that person is really smart. But maybe they hang up and say, wow, that company really cares about people.
Yeah.
And I think the second one is more powerful and more helpful to a business.
I so agree. This is so nice. Yeah.
100%. And back to our point about when folks are a bit anxious or reserved or scared, I think they are underestimating how much of an endearing experience this can be for the customer. So you're on the farm there. So when I was with John Deere, we were often interviewing folks as compact tractors. So we were visiting folks very much like yourself, going out and looking at their tractors and walking over their property and
fruit farmers.
Fruit farmers. Yeah. It's, all across the country. But what's interesting, when you're approaching somebody's home on a couple of 100 acres in the middle of nowhere, a lot of times you meet a lot of variety of people. A lot of folks, if they're living in a pretty away from people, that's a lifestyle they've chosen, and they're not used to these people with their clipboards. It's sort of an unusual. They're very standoffish. It's like they're very anxious and nervous as we're approaching, which makes us. But fast forward a couple hours after we're just listening, and we're deeply exploring their challenges, their tractor, and here and there, and we can hardly leave because they're like, oh, they're just they are so endeared to us, and they are literally like, hey, call me the next time you're in town, and it's amazing what that experience is like. And of course, by the time we've got our data, we're sort of wanting to, get out of there. And they're like following us to the car, talking. I cannot tell you what a common experience that is. And I hearken back to something you said, a lot of people, they just, when did somebody sit there and just listen to them for an hour and a half or 2 hours? And just listen and not only listen, but was deeply interested in what challenges they had. It was an amazing experience. And, if for B2C, so if I'm interviewing tractor owners somewhere, if they like me or don't like me, John Deere makes a lot of tractors, it doesn't matter. But B2B, it turns out that relationship is kind of important. And so this endearing of the interviewee and interviewers is a pretty important thing. Anyway, I wanted to circle back around to that. Now, in your book, you say, ask for clarification even when you don't need it. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit.
I can elaborate that, but first I want to talk about tractors.
Oh, good.
Because one of my favorite interviews that I did years ago, that is one that, people will ask me for, like, some of the different use cases. And I use this one all the time. It was a company that makes software for tractors. And I was saying how, they use us because they are getting health reports back from the tractor every day. They're getting the coordinates back. And so first they need to be able to convert the coordinates into an address to know where it is, for example, that it's in Delaware. But they also need to add the time zone to it because they need to make sure that the status report back from the tractor that came back at 11:59 every day is correctly time-stamped to being at 11:59 in Delaware and not, the one in California is also getting timestamped at 11:59. And I remember this, talking to this person, this was years before I lived on a farm, being like, wow, I didn't even really realize that was a thing. And they use our product. Like, that's so cool. But then people ask me, like, what kinds of customers you have? Banks and insurance companies and academic researchers and tractors, software for tractors. And the people like, software for tractors? And then, but it really is true. Like, it really does endear people to the interviewer and to, you to the customer as well. And I think that's so powerful for when we're building something, to really, having that use case in mind, having stood in the field with them and you can see, okay, well, geez, this is like, this is why this handle isn't working for them, right? Like they've got a whole bunch of other stuff in their hands. They got the dog running around, right? Like, you really get it. But also for them, like, I find that the customers that I interview, they're the ones who become our most vocal supporters. They're the ones offering to do a testimonial without us asking, offering to do a case study, telling other companies about us, telling their friends about us, like, because it is so rare just to feel like a company even cares about you. I mean, how many of us have spent hours on the phone with an airline, right? Like, we're just so used to feeling disposable and not listened to, that when you have a company that does take that time, whether it's a founder or a product person or a consultant on behalf of that company, like, you just feel like they care. And that is powerful.
Yeah. And I'm sure if you kind of if you can get that one step further into the product, it will just, it just shows. I mean, you will, if you're really kind of, you're curious and you're interested and you learn something about your customer, and then you have the ability to translate that into a product, which is a whole different thing. But if you can really do this, I think it will show, and it will just be more successful. I mean, but on the one hand, from a very distance, you could say, well, but why don't we do this all the time? Like, for me, maybe I'm just too much in my bubble here, but the kind of advantages of doing this, and you emphasize this as well, like, try to talk to your customer or customers every week if you can, like, try to fit in, or at least make it a regular thing to do this. I'm sometimes kind of taken aback of why don't we do this all the time, and why do companies not do this all the time? Because for me, at least, the advantage seems so obvious. Like, it's just clear. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think so. To get back to the earlier question about talking about tractors, about asking clarification questions even when you don't need them. That was your question, right, Scott?
Right, yeah. Yes.
So this is kind of a you basically, even when you understand something, when you ask someone to clarify it, they will give you more detail. So for example, you can say, somebody says, oh yeah, I took the tractor out to harrow. And then you can say, oh, so you took the tractor out to harrow. Right. And then it's like, well, yeah, because I needed to get it ready. Like, and right. And then they will start talking. But then you can also ask for clarification incorrectly, which will get them to elaborate even more. And so they say, first I take the harrow out, and then, I'm doing this and blah, 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 and I'm out in the fields. And then you say, so let me just make sure I have that correctly. First you plow the fields, and then they'll correct you, and they say, no, actually I take the harrow first, and here's why. And then and all this kind of stuff, they'll completely forget that you mixed that up, but you will get so much detail back from them. And the value of this, and I think what's kind of counterintuitive to people, is because when you already understand a process, you're like, oh, well, of course they're going to use the harrow in this situation, right? Like, you can be like, well, why is this particular person using the harrow at that particular time? And what is that whole experience like for them? And if you're somebody who makes harrows, like, this is very crucial information to you. You know a lot about the product, but you want to hear about how the customer is actually using it literally in the field. And they will give you so much detail when you ask for clarification, even when you don't need it, or when you ask for clarification and you intentionally rephrase their process incorrectly, but just slightly enough. You just switch, a phase of the process, or you use a slightly different tool reference, for example.
I love the tactic.
Yeah.
The phrase it slightly incorrect. That's a definite new tool in my box that was not there before. As you described that, you reminded me of something. When I read your book, well, let me say something. When I read Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, who is
So
a
good.
hostage negotiator, I felt like I discovered something. And I was like, I saw all this relevance for customer interviewing. And I sort of thought I was like, wow, I don't know. Anyway, when I read your book, you also reference his book, and you're the only other person that I've run across that has specifically mentioned this book on hostage negotiation as having useful things for customer interviewing. Could you elaborate on that? What did you see in his techniques that because you just put one of them to practice in your example? I wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah. So that connection kind of came to me when I was in business school. So I was in business school part-time. I started in 2017. So right around the time I went full-time on my business. And I took a negotiations class as part of that degree, which was, maybe one of the most important classes I've ever taken, and just, in multiples has paid for my degree. And so I was, reading that book as part of the class. And I remember like learning about these things. I was like, oh, this is just like a customer interview, except you've kind of got like this motive attached to it. But like, I found that sort of the base skills for negotiation were very similar to an interview. Now they're very different in a lot of cases, like, with Chris Voss, for example, he's trying to get a hostage out of a bank. And there's a very high stakes. There's a very specific goal in mind. For an exploratory interview, you may not have that specific kind of point you're trying to drive at in the end. Definitely much more relaxed, but a lot of the tactics used are quite similar. And I like quoting his book a lot in my book, because I could quote other people, but interviewing sounds to critics, it sounds like soft and fluffy. And if you quote somebody who's a former FBI chief hostage negotiator, it no longer sounds fluffy. One review online sort of, said that I over relied on his book, but I intentionally used him and his book to remind people that this is not just a soft skill, right? This is a very respectable, serious skill that if this is what gets hostages out of a situation, not going in guns blazing, but like, talking to the hostage taker, right? Like, and this is what you do. Like, if it works in that situation, then it's going to work for you to try to figure out why people are canceling your software. I
think one of the commonalities is you're trying to learn. He's trying to learn from the hostage taker, essentially, probably anything he can that might help, something that he can provide, or something that helps to negotiate the situation. And when we're clearly just trying to learn. So the technique I observed you using, even in your example, was like, well, I take the harrow out in the yard, and he would have you repeat back. So you take the harrow out in the yard, and then just let it, repeat their words back to him and
let it hang. Yeah, just repeat exactly what they have said back.
Yeah. So I was very excited to see I wasn't the only person that saw that connection. I want to talk
about such a good book.
Such a good book. I want to talk about a rubber duck. You've got a rubber duck on the cover. Surely this is a popular question. I love it. It gives your book kind of an icon. Tell us about the rubber duck. What's the deal behind that?
Yeah, so the concept of the rubber duck, it's inspired by something from the famous book, The Pragmatic Programmer, which is I think it's from the 90s, a book about programming. And it says, in order to figure out a problem with code, developers should keep a rubber duck on their desk to talk to when they're trying to figure out a problem. And in the process of talking to the duck, they will realize the solution themselves and then be able to get back to work. And I was kind of inspired by this because, I realized, years ago when with our business, my husband is the developer and I have some experience with coding, but, I'm a product person. And And, at dinner time, he would be telling me about something he was trying to figure out. And I knew that like, I can't tell him about, how to do things with the load balancers or the servers or whatever. Right. But like, I can ask questions and I can listen. And my job is functionally to help him figure it out on his own. And I realized a while ago that it's actually kind of a lot like you're doing in an interview. Of course, you have an agenda, you have your questions, right? But like you were just sort of there to absorb. And so you kind of picture yourself as the rubber duck, who is just there to listen, just there to absorb and just hear what somebody else has to say. Now, you're not necessarily trying to help them solve a specific problem, as I might be with, my husband and all of his servers. But it's like I think it's just helpful to kind of picture that in your head. It's like, okay, I'm not somebody who's here to talk and here to say things and here to, as we talked about earlier, sound smart, right? And show what I'm all about. I'm just here to be a duck that is just going to listen. And I think it's kind of just a helpful little, not a, benemic, but like, just like a little thing to kind of like, remember if you feel yourself talking a bit too much or whatever, just like remind yourself, like, I'm just picture myself as the duck. I'm just there to listen, just here to absorb the story.
And it's great to have a tangible reminder. Yeah. So it's funny, as I was thinking, a lot of things came to mind when I read that story. First of all, Larry King said that, I don't learn anything while I'm talking, but I think you do learn stuff while you're talking. Because first of all, to begin with the way you phrase it, yes, you're the duck, the customer's talking, but also I see it in an interview where that can be reversed. But when you're talking, you're explaining to the customer the way you understand it, checking with them, verifying with them, paraphrasing. I think I heard you say A, B, C, D, E, and then they'll to correct you, where it's off. So even though you're actually talking, you're internalizing this to better understand it, which I think can help you to ask better questions. And also you're being very respectful because you're not assuming. You're being very respectful of, this is what I thought you said. You take the harrow here and you do this and you harvest the raspberries and do I have that? I don't want, in other words, you're signaling, I don't want to leave this until you give me permission that this
right.
is correct. And then
it's like deferential in a way.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I love and think about like when you're studying in school, one of the things that was helpful for me personally was studying with other people and trying to explain it back to them, this idea in my head. I can't do that in my room by myself. But if I'm explaining it to my folks I'm studying with, or even if I'm trying to teach it, it sort of lines itself up a little better.
And by the way, you actually talk about this notion of making people feel like they are teachers in the book.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, and this is something that the famous marketing psychology professor, Robert Cialdini, found. Was that one of the most powerful ways to influence someone else is to elevate them to the position of teacher. And to what we were talking about earlier about how can I make sure that they know that I have some expertise in this. They're teaching you about their experience. So you might be a subject matter expert, but you are not an expert in their experience. Only they are an expert in their own experience. And that is what you are trying to learn.
Yeah. I somehow can't resist. I'm very sorry. So I have two things, but so I have a philosophy background. That's why I kind of can't resist, because it sounds so Socratic. So if you have the time, what is the one famous sentence that Socrates always says is, I know that I know nothing. So he acknowledges in a certain way that he knows nothing, and then he walks around and lets people tell him, okay, what's freedom, what's justice, what's blah, blah, blah. Then a whole bunch of problems ensue, but that's not a question. But taking this stance of, I'm not the person that knows. So, please, you customer, educate me. Tell me what kind of what you know, and I want to learn from you, is really flipping this around. And I think this is kind of a certain kind of a stance that you need to take, but really, and I love the metaphor that you used before, gives the stage to the other person, like giving the stage to the other person, and but not in a way that puts them on a spot, but really in a way that makes them open up. So I think, I don't know, maybe that's too far-fetched, but that's what I was thinking about. The second question is, or well, that was more of a remark. The question is, does your husband have a rubber duck? Or
I think of myself as his rubber duck, but actually I was at a a street fair a couple weekends ago, and there was an artist selling glass art, and one of them happened to be a little rubber duck, and I was like, oh, that needs to go on my desk in the shed quarters. What's really interesting about the sort of Socratic dialogue, is that what it's called, right?
Yeah.
Or Socratic questioning, like I think you're kind of really the first person to really bring that perspective into it. I can really see that.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage you. I mean, because I think it's about a lot of what you're saying is about what stance do you take towards yourself. I mean, and it's very awkward. It's a very unusual position for somebody. If they're starting to do interviews, it's a very unusual position to kind of just take yourself back. Usually it's the other way around, even especially if you are in a big corporate, or other contexts, you're very used to putting yourself in the front. You have to fight for stuff. You have to, anyway. And then suddenly the light goes on. There is a customer, and making that switch of, it's not about me. I want to learn from you. That is not something we often do in our lives. It's a very unusual experience, probably in the beginning, and I think so. That's why it reminded me so much of this Socratic way of questioning, because there is also the belief in there in the Socratic method, at least, that the other person knows, like you know. And I just, at one point he says, I'm just bringing out something you already know.
Yes.
So, and then I think that is kind of the stance, or that was what I'm at least was thinking about when you explained like how to do interview.
Yeah, and that's, I think, is something I love about the rubber duck idea. Even the original story of it is that it assumes that the answer is already within the programmer, right?
Yeah.
And I think that I don't know, I guess sort of affirming the underlying validity of what the other person thinks and feels and knows is incredibly important. Even if you're not helping the customer figure out a problem, you're approaching it from the perspective that their perspective and their process is valid, even if it seems convoluted and complicated and inefficient to you. There is an internal logic there, and you have to start with the assumption that what they are doing makes sense to them.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't, sort of make sense to you, or make sense to you on a general basis, right? Or maybe they don't think it makes sense, and they will tell you, but there is even the most convoluted process has an internal logic to it, and it has it for a reason. And if you're trying to sell them a product that fits somewhere into that process, which arguably everything is from a jobs to be done perspective, then you need to take that process at its at its face value in order to help someone improve it. Because if you just kind of come in with a wrecking ball and say, well, that process is convoluted, you should do this instead, you're missing it entirely.
Yeah. I love that you kind of connect this to jobs to be done, which we haven't mentioned. So maybe, I don't know, but maybe we should go in there. I mean, you mentioned this a couple of times throughout your book, the importance of jobs to be done and jobs to be done thinking. So maybe can you elaborate a little bit on this, and how you maybe also kind of learned about it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like jobs to be done it is the heart and underpinning of the book and the methodology. But since it's intended to be a practical book, I did not want to dwell too much on theory. I also didn't want to make the reader feel like they should understand all of the theory, because I wanted to get them to action and insights as quickly as possible. And so it was like, how can I teach them about jobs to be done throughout the process of learning this? So we don't have to first be like, okay, first we're going to learn this theory. Like there's a couple chapters in the beginning that are kind of on that, but it's very basic. There's references to jobs to be done books, but it's not like, that's more of like when you get time. And if you want, like, here's a breadcrumb, here's something you can go with further. Like it was very important to me to do like basically just focus on the things that I felt like were not sufficiently covered in other books, and then signpost to those other books. Like I didn't want to write a book that had already been written. And so it's very much the underlying of the book. And I learned about jobs to be done when I was learning about interviews. So it's really, and activity theory and all that kind of stuff all around the same time. So it very much guides my perspective on this. But I intentionally don't talk about it too much directly in the book, because I'm just like, let's just get you to implementing this. And then if you want to, you know, you can go read some Clayton Christensen articles. You can read a Bob Moesta book. Like you can do that after we've kind of satisfied your, like, these fears you have about doing the interviews and what do you actually do. And like, that was what I really wanted to focus on, but I could talk about jobs to be done all day.
No, but I love this. I think it's I mean, it's in a sense, it's, I mean, nobody, put it bluntly, nobody wants to learn about jobs to be done. Let's be honest. I mean, just a couple of weird guys like me, Scott and Jonathan, but like, so
your job is not to learn about jobs to be done, right? That is like learning jobs to be done is not the job, right?
Exactly.
I want to learn jobs to be done so I can do something else.
That's what I meant.
Which is the sort of, it's like this kind of, it's pretty funny actually. But yeah, when you think about that, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think so from that perspective, I really liked it. So you give the hints, you give the books, but you say it in the very beginning. I mean, you can go down that rabbit hole, then go there, but here is what you want to do. I mean, if you want to interview, here are the steps. And that's the job that they have. So I really like it. So it's perfectly fine.
Yeah. I think that was I think it was a very informed, inspired choice to stay out of some of that jobs to be done depth for that new interviewer. I mean, you have exactly the practical information they need at their fingertips. And as you know, Jan mentioned Jonathan. Now we tend to go deep into jobs to be done, which almost can make it difficult to teach at times, because it's hard to back up. Well, wait a minute, this person doesn't need all of this, which really gets me to my next question. You know, if we have somebody listening that, you know, is just really brand new, they just really want to understand interviewing for the first, you know, they feel like they need to do it in their role. What's step one? What advice would you give somebody who wants to learn how to do this?
Get my book, either the physical version or an audio book, depending on how you consume books. But then there's a chapter in there that says, you know, it's basically how to get started with interviewing, no customers required. And that's that section on how to practice interviewing. And it's basically a roadmap for getting started with this.
And maybe just to add on to this, so you discussed these exercises previously. Again, being less experienced in interviews, something that perplexes me slightly is, what do you have in your mind when you're interviewing? So, I mean, because you still want to have some kind of roadmap, or is your mind just blank, or do you kind of have a check that, okay, I know I need to still get information about this and this and that? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, so you always have a roadmap, and I feel like the script is really that roadmap. I always suggest, first of all, having a script, probably, you know, workshopping it with your team. This is something that Stripe does when they're doing interviews. They always just practice their scripts on one another, make sure it flows. Even though it usually does not follow the script exactly. And that's actually often the sign of a great interview, that it doesn't follow the order. But then printing it out and giving yourself like 5 carriage returns in between each question so that you can jot down notes And so you can say, okay, I asked my first question. They actually answered these 2 questions on the front page. And then they gave me little hints about this other one. I'm just going to jot that down quickly for later. Maybe I can jump to those questions now, and then we can get back to us. And so it kind of reminds you of where you're going. But then also kind of using frameworks, using jobs to be done in that. So, for example, somebody tells you about a problem they have, and then, following up is, okay, well, how often does this happen? When was the last time they did this? Using, the jobs to be done pieces like functional, social, and emotional, like saying, okay, so you told me that you took the tractor out in the field and you used the harrow. Was there anyone else you were working with on that? Right. Or like, when was the last time you did this? And if it turns out they only do, well, harrow is a terrible example of this, but like, if they only do it every 10 years, they're not going to be somebody you want to talk to, rather than somebody who is taking their tractor out every week to pull up weeds in the fields, like we are. Harrow, then that's somebody who's going to give you a lot of good information, right? And so like kind of having a script, maybe having a bank of questions to fall back on, and then kind of just giving yourself sort of some guardrails almost of when to know to dig deeper. And so asking them, how often does this happen? Like, can I ask you just like, how much are you currently paying for this? Or how much time do you spend on it? Right? Like, and then that will sort of help you guide the conversation. I mean, something I love about interviews is that oftentimes you learn the thing that you went into it hoping to learn, but oftentimes you learn something else that you had no idea was even there. And it turns out to be much bigger than the thing that you thought you were researching. And to me, that's so exciting. And so yes, you have a script, but and you have kind of a direction that you're looking to go in, right? But also you need to leave some of that analysis for afterwards, and not try to sit there and rebuild your product strategy while you're talking, because then you're not listening, you're rebuilding your product strategy in your head.
Yeah. Maybe now is a good moment. How do you deal with probably a big fear as well is exactly what we had now, pauses and silence. So how do you deal with the pause or a moment of silence within an interview? Because probably a lot of people are afraid of this.
What's interesting is it's also culturally dependent how much you would be afraid of a pause. And I think it's the first thing is for people to calibrate themselves and understand what their own natural inclination for pausing and leaving space, and when they know to jump into a conversation. I love the linguist Dr. Deborah Tannen's work on this. She's recorded conversations throughout the decades, and some people show engagement by interrupting people and talking over them. By contrast, people from, so that's, I think she says people from New York and New England, which is where I'm from. People from California, for example, they might wait for a pause. People in Japan would wait for an even longer pause to feel like it's their turn to speak. And so if you put somebody from New York in the room with somebody from Japan, like the person from Japan is going to feel like they never get a chance to speak. And the person from New York is going to think they're not interested. So it's important to first calibrate and just notice your own conversation style. And it's like, do I feel like I'm having a really good conversation with someone when I say something and then there's a pause and then I get to continue talking? Or I pause and then they say something? Or I don't even pause and then they talk over me and they're finishing my sentence and they're showing that they are, I feel understood that way. Right. And so just kind of calibrating that first and knowing where you are, but then also that pauses are so powerful. Right. And even if it's awkward, it can be really good. So there's an American radio host named Terry Gross who she says that she will pause for 3 beats longer than is comfortable and let the other person fill that space. And often what they will fill that space with is the most interesting part of the interview. Now, sometimes it gets to be awkward, but you can use that to your advantage, right? Like if you ask, a big question and you give them that pause and the other person says, "Are you still there? Can you hear me?" You can say something that compliments them and throws the ball back to them. like, oh yeah, I was just taking notes on that last thing you said. It sounded really important. And now you've just told them, wow, they're really listening to me and what I'm saying is important. Okay, what was I just talking about? Well, I guess I was talking about the harrow. That was the important thing. Yeah. Can you just say more about that? Well, I feel like I already said it, but well, I forgot something, right? Like that always people will tell you that they don't have anything to say and then they will keep talking, which is it's so funny. But so you can or you can say, oh yeah, I was just giving you space to think. Right. To what we were talking about earlier, like adopting this almost deferential posture towards them.
Yeah, I'm just thinking so much about my own. I should do such a self-assessment. I feel like I'm a New Yorker or something like that. But anyway.
I was determined not to speak first after that.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I was
hang out there. I was just like, I'm just gonna let. I'm gonna be the last to talk.
To be very honest, I was thinking.
Notice how you talk with your best friends from growing up, right? I was talking to one of my best friends from high school a couple weeks ago. I don't necessarily notice this when I'm talking to, say, my husband or my in-laws or friends of mine in my daily life, right? But I was talking to one of my friends from high school. And I noticed, I got off the call and I just felt so energized afterwards, but I noticed the way we talked to one another and that conversation flow, right? Like when even if you're an introvert, right? Like that, what feels the most comfortable to you, notice how that conversation is. Is there a lot of pausing? Is there a lot of sort of, and this might be regional, it might just be you as a person. Or are you talking over one another? Is it very animated? Like, are you finishing each other's sentences? And that's what makes you feel understood, right? Like notice, like just call up your high school best friend and just notice how you talk and how they talk.
I think this is fantastic because, in most voice of customer courses, this is usually covered, the topic of silence. But here's what I've heard that I've never heard before is how it can be culturally different. And that you need a self-aware. I'm trying to paraphrase back to you. So a couple of things, you need to have a self-awareness of your own preference or style, and also the person you communicate with. There, you just be aware that you don't know what theirs is going in, and maybe it's something you can be listening out for. That's a much more sophisticated way to approach it than just leave the silence out there, which is. I get this is often good advice, but but I'll be chewing on that one for a little bit. I'm not sure what my style. I'm not sure what mine is. That's excellent.
And now we're all letting it hang.
And I have no one there to speak.
Now we're just showing off how we can
Oh, look at us interviewers. Look how much we can pause.
But it wasn't that long, to be very.
No, it was.
Right? But then somebody would you feel that urge to jump in and fill it.
Yeah.
And when we're interviewing someone, we want them to talk.
We do.
I was honestly, so one thing is about thinking about customer reviews, but I just had so many flashbacks to discussions with my wife, to be honest, where I feel like this could be really helpful of analyzing because I am somebody who jumps in, and interviewing for me takes a lot of energy. I mean, I can do maybe 2 a day, but it takes a lot of energy for me because I have a tendency to feel like I have to speak and explain and talk and all that. So, and then that's why I like doing interviews, because I have to switch around a lot of my usual inclinations, but it takes a lot of energy for me really to prepare myself mentally first, and then really assuming that position and basically shutting up, because it's not what I do. But I tend to jump in, and it's a horrible habit, but I have this habit of jumping into somebody is speaking and finishing this, not in an interview, but in a friend conversation, like a friendly conversation with people. I will just start blabbering in the middle of their sentence, which is a horrible habit. And maybe I need a little bit more self-reflection on this. I don't know.
I think you're a duck. Think of yourself as a duck.
I mean, exactly.
You're the duck.
Something I feel like, you have to say is first, I think that all conversation styles are valid, right? So even if it turns out that in an interview, you need to learn to give them more space and use pausing and not talk over them, right? That doesn't mean you have to change how you talk in your normal life, right? That doesn't mean that's not a valid way of communicating, because in the family you grew up in, that was probably the way you needed to communicate in order to, make yourself seen and heard, right? Like, or in the community you grew up in, right? Like, so that, like, it's valid regardless of what you need to change about how you talk in an interview. By the way, Deborah Tannen has a great book about men and women communicating with one another, and you would probably find it very insightful, because it'll say, like, the wife, they're the man and wife are driving on a road trip, and the husband says, oh, I've heard this place has good sandwiches, and the wife goes, oh, really? And then just leaves it there. And what the husband is trying to say is, I'm hungry, and she's saying, oh, he read a news article about a new sandwich place, and he's telling me about it. Okay. Right. Like, something completely different is communicated. And so I think you might find that book helpful. She's also done a ton of podcasts on it. But Jonathan, I'm really curious what you think about this, because I notice where Jan is, sort of very eager to share and jump in. You are definitely more hanging back a little bit. And I'm curious how you feel about these sort of tactics of interviewing, and how you maybe change yourself or not when you're interviewing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm definitely more introvert, more of an introvert person. So that's the first things. And I also think, just generally speaking, there's three of us, and you do mention in your book, actually, that you should be maximum 2 people to interview. And I don't want to speak over people, and especially on this topic where I believe I have less experience than both Scott and Jan. So I just want to give a bit more space to them, because I know that they're very experienced on this topic. So I think it's contextual given the topic of our discussion. But yeah, I think also, generally speaking, I'm probably more of a more introverted. That's about it, I think.
I feel like we got Michele in action a little bit there.
But so when you go to interview, Jonathan, I'm just curious, like, do you have to poke yourself to talk more?
Definitely. I think, as you very nicely said, that there isn't one style that's better than the other. I think it's very much dependent on the dynamic between the people talking, and maybe in discovery interview, a customer interview, you probably should lean on giving a bit more space much more space to the person you're interviewing. But as you said, when people speak in a very animated way and maybe finish each other's sentences, this is also an indication that you're interested in what the person is saying. So I don't think, as you very nicely said, that there's necessarily a generally better way of being in interaction, in communication with others. But again, I mean, on the customer interview side, I have very little experience, so I don't really have enough experience to actually talk about it. And the main reason also, I wanted to give some space for the experienced people to talk about it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But usually he has the best, like, he's preparing a question for half an hour, and then
that's right,
out of nowhere comes this very, very on point questions, and I have no clue how to answer it. So usually that's
a lot of depth, 100%. Yeah. That was sort of cool right then, though, because I feel like we got to see Michele in action a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well done.
That was fantastic. And of course, I interrupted in the middle too. Well, I'm gonna get bad.
No, I can definitely see the power there of the interviewing. Yeah, but very good.
Yeah, but I said that, but truly, I mean, that was a fantastic example, Michele. I mean, you really made it such a safe place for Jonathan to say anything. That was amazing,
and I felt compelled to talk about my introversion and quite personal stuff, actually, I would say. But
just safe place here, Jonathan. Well, let's see. We're getting towards the end. Anything else about interviewing, Michele, you'd like to that we didn't ask you about? We probably should have.
I feel like you're borrowing something from my book there with the reaching for the door question.
Maybe.
Exactly.
I think not to talk about Jonathan for too much longer, because I can get the sense that that's not his most comfortable place of being in the spotlight about this. But I think not having experience in a field can actually be quite helpful in interviewing, because as Jan said, you ask the question that really cuts deep on it. Or in the case of this conversation, right? Like, there are probably people listening who are learning about jobs to be done. They're not listening because they're already an expert and want to be reminded about how much they're an expert. They're listening because they're learning. And so Jonathan asking questions, he's asking the questions that the listener has themselves, but maybe they feel embarrassed to ask, that maybe Jan or Scott would not think of because they have so much experience in this. And when I started interviewing, I was working in financial publishing, and I remember one of the first sets of interviews I did was with people who were in the process of retiring or had already retired. And I was not an expert in bonds. I was not an expert in portfolio construction. I was a product person. And so I genuinely did not know a lot of things about finance. And when I had interviews with people, okay, well, can you ask me why you started taking distributions at 71 from your retirement account, for example, which is a very US centric kind of question, but I was interviewing Americans about it. And they'd be like, oh, well, that's because it's, legally required at 71 and a half. And like, I didn't know that, but like a financial planner would not have asked that question. Right. But then I could say, oh, interesting. So what was that like when you finally went to that process? Like, was there a lot of paperwork involved? Right. But, to what we were talking about, the role of expertise in this and communicating your own expertise, because I genuinely didn't have that expertise, I was able to like lean into that a little bit. And I was also sort of in the position where, unfortunately, sometimes the people I was interviewing were like, who is this young woman? She clearly has no idea what she's talking about. And I realized, rather than being offended, I could lean into the fact that they thought I was an idiot, and they would tell me everything. And I mean, I remember there was actually one time I was interviewing someone, and I think I had almost gone a little too far on it's not quite playing dumb, but like I did, my stance was too much that I didn't know what I was talking about, and she was teaching me about the concept in general rather than about her experience of the concept. And I remember she said to me at some point, "What are you, stupid or something? You don't understand me?" And this is on the phone, and so there's no video. And I remember just like, I was interviewing with somebody else, and I threw up goalposts because I was like, I was just like, I was like, touchdown, right? Because like, this means she's going to give me everything. And she did, right? Because she thought she really had to explain it at this level because I didn't understand it. And it worked marvelously. And so being a newcomer in a field can be incredibly helpful. But there is kind of a line to walk there. And I think sometimes I went too far of making it clear that you want to hear about their experience and you want them to teach you about their experience and not about the concept in general.
It sounds like the thing you really put your own ego aside for the sake of learning, for the greater purpose. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. It's not about you. It's about them and what you're trying to learn.
Yeah.
And later on, when you're analyzing it, then it's okay. Well, what does our company do with this information? How does this actually plug into our roadmap? Like what, that happens afterwards. But during the interview, you want them to forget you're a person, and you kind of almost want to forget you're a person too.
You want to be a duck.
Exactly.
I love it. I love it so much. Well, what's next for Michele Hansen?
I am excited to be taking the book sort of on tour physically. I've done a lot of sort of podcasts about it. So I did a podcast book tour, of which this is part of that. But I'm going to, start doing workshops at conferences and speaking at conferences. I do have a full-time job already, so I'm not going to be doing consulting or workshops for companies. Of course, there's a lot of wonderful people who already do that, like yourself, Scott. But that's what I'm excited to do. And I just love talking to people about talking to people. So I'm just really excited. I'm going to be in Aarhus, Denmark in June, as well as Hamburg, Germany. And then I'll be speaking in Belgium in October, doing a workshop as well. And probably more on the calendar in the future, but really excited to just, get out there and talk to people about talking to people.
You're going on tour. It's excellent.
Yeah.
Shirts made. But
I did make some for myself, actually, that have rubber ducks on them. Yeah. And then to wear, like under my blazer when I'm on stage or whatever. And then for, the happy hour afterwards, I have one that says, with a duck on it, that says, talk to me about customer interviews.
Oh my gosh. The possibilities are amazing. Like if you could have people, if you answer a question, you could throw ducks from the stage. I mean,
you get a duck and you get a duck. Yeah.
Play Rubber Ducky by Ernie as your intro music or outro music. I mean, you could, it's a lot of fun there. But I cannot recommend this book enough. I can Deploy Empathy, available on Amazon. Also, you mentioned that you might listen to it or read it. I personally did both. I bought 2 copies. I recommend that. I think you internalize information slightly differently. I like to be able to have the paper. I'm getting back away from Kindle personally. I mean, I love Kindle, but I'm getting where I like the paper book. I like to highlight things. I like to scribble things, learning style or something. But I also like personally to have the audiobook. And with yours, I really enjoyed both. And again, you did a fantastic job narrating it. I felt like I know you. You can follow Michele on Twitter at MJ Hansen. That's Hansen. Also listen to the Software Social podcast hosted by Michele and Colleen Schnettler as they discuss their journeys as indie SaaS entrepreneurs. Their website is softwaresocial.dev. Michele, is there anything else you'd like to let folks know about?
deployempathy.com. You can read the introduction to the book. You can also see the newsletter where I both wrote the whole rough draft and am sending out updates every so often with new talks I'm giving, both in person and online. So it's often a video recording, but you don't have to buy the book. Most of the scripts and the tactics and everything are right there in the newsletter. So you could go there if you're not in a position or interest to buy it right now. But that's deployempathy.com.
But I recommend buying the book.
Do too.
Okay, so what one final question. If you're going to assemble your own conference for product managers or whatever you want in the audience, and as part of the program, you get to show a movie as part of your program. What movie are you going to show and why?
Ooh, can I show a TV show?
Yes.
Yes, I would probably show an episode of the American version of Whose Line Is It Anyway from the 90s, because customer interviews are not a conversation. They're more like acting, and they're really like improv, where you basically have to go with what the other person says. And so adopting that kind of yes and improv mindset, where you are adding to whatever they say, even if it seems illogical or absurd to you. That's how you make an interview work, and that's how improv works.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, and
Indy Young also. We had a chat with her that she was big in the yes and as well.
Yeah, so, love her books.
Oh, we do too. She was wonderful. So yes, and so if you're a product manager, if you're in marketing, innovation, or product development, or an old pro, or either new, we highly recommend Michele's book, Deploy Empathy. It fills a space in the innovation literature that has been missing for quite a while, in my opinion. And that, friends, concludes today's Product Quest podcast. Please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and we will see you next time.